If you'd like to learn all of the chords, the worst way you could do that is to try to individually memorize the formulas for each chord. I know that because that's how I tried to do things, and it took me nearly 10 years to figure them all out. But recently, I discovered there's an actually simple and fairly consistent way to work with all of the different chord labels, and I'm really excited to share that with you here, because it's the kind of thing I wish somebody had taught me earlier when I had first started learning music theory. It would have saved years of struggles. Now, this is not a beginner's lesson, but it's also not super advanced either. You should know a little bit about the major scale, how that converts into intervals and scale degrees. You should know a little bit about chords. But there's going to be a ton of information in this short little video, and it's going to be easy to forget some of it. So I'm also including a free PDF that you can download. Just click the link below in the video description. You can download this. You don't even have to give me your email address. Lastly, you should know that everything I'm about to teach you here comes directly out of chapter 25 of my new book, The Signals Music Chord Progression Codex. I spent nearly 2 years working on this. I'm very proud of how it turned out, and it's now available on my site, signalsmusicstudio.com. But enough talking. Let's get down to business. We have to learn every single chord in modern music. And to do that, fortunately, we'll actually only need to memorize the formula for 5 little chords. I'm serious. We'll only need to study and master 5 chords. And from there, we'll be able to turn those 5 chords into anything else we want. So since we only need to memorize 5, we're going to really slow down for this section of the video. This is going to be the most confusing, most difficult part of the entire lesson, and the longest. But after that, we're just going to start cruising through and we're going to start making new chords easily. So just bear with this first little section. What we're going to do is build our 5 stock chords, or our 5 default chords. And to do that, I'm going to take a pretty weird path. I'm going to take a major scale, C major for example, and I'm going to start on that major scale's 5th note. We always call the 5th note of a scale the dominant. Now that I've started on that 5th note, which is G, I'm going to start skipping notes, all right? I get G and B. Well, that's not a chord. G and B is just it's an interval, or it's a dyad. But if I skip another note, I get G, B, D. Well, now I have what is called a G major chord. And to write that, because this is a stock chord, this is a default chord, we just write G. We don't have to write G major. We don't have to tell you major. We just write G. It's assumed that when you just write a letter, that we're talking about this interval structure of a 1, a 3, and a 5. And we call that major, and we just write it as G. Easy. Now, let's skip another note. We get to the note F. The distance between where we started, G, and this last note F, that distance is a distance of a minor 7th, which in scale degrees is flat 7. However, the chord is called G7. It's not called G flat 7. So this is the most confusing thing in the entire video, and it's one of those things you just have to accept. That in chord labels, the 7 by default is flat 7. All right? This is the only place in music where 7 means flat 7. Everywhere else, 7 means 7. But in a chord label, by default, the 7 is a flat 7. If you can remember that, everything else regarding chords is going to become much easier. So we have 2 chords we need to memorize, G, G7. The next chord we need to memorize is G9, and this is an easy one. We just skip another note in our major scale, and we find this note A. If we look at the interval between G and A, well, this is a 9th, and it's the exact same thing as a 2nd. All right, there's nothing goofy about this. 2nds and 9ths are just interchangeable. When we want to add in this A, we don't have to play it up high as a 9th. We can also add it in as a 2nd. So just kind of keep that in mind throughout the rest of this video, that 9ths, 2nds, pretty much the same thing. We'll need to memorize G9. We'll also need to memorize G11, which you might be able to guess happens when I skip another note. Now, 11ths and 4ths are the exact same thing, and that's a real 4th. It's a perfect 4th above my root. It's not flatted like our 7. So when you see 11, just think 4, and you'll know to build a perfect 4th to add that note to it. Lastly, the biggest chord we can build using this technique is G13. This adds in the 13th, which is equivalent to the 6th. Identical and interchangeable. But you see, if we try skipping another note, we just end up on G again, so we'll just end up repeating ourselves. And this is the biggest chord that we can create using this technique. And these are the only chords you'll need to memorize. I swear, you need to know G7, G9, G11, G13. These are our stock chords, and every single one of them contains a flat 7. If you understand that, and if you're comfortable with that, we can move on and we can start creating a whole swath of new chords. First, let's introduce this symbol. This means that 7th, you know, that by default our 7th is flat. Well, this is saying, hey, that 7th gets raised. So we can just throw this into the chord label right after the root of the chord, and it says, hey, raise the 7th of our default chord. So G7 used to look like this, 1, 3, 5, flat 7. G major 7, well, 1, 3, 5, major 7. And that works all the way down. G major 9, G major 11, G major 13. the same as our stock chords. We've just modified them with this one symbol. Keep in mind, this symbol also appears as a little delta or triangle too, so you might see the same thing written that way. Cool, so we just learned 4 more chords. That was easy. Let's learn 4 more with this symbol. This is written as a little M or the minor sign or a little minus sign. And this tells us we're lowering the third in our default chord. That's it. It doesn't talk about the minor scale, it's not talking about the 7th, it's only talking about the third. So if we take our default chords, and if we throw this symbol in there, well, it lowers the third of each one. And we get G minor 7, G minor 9, G minor 11, G minor 13. Really easy way to calculate those chords. Just take our default chord, lower the thirds. Now what's pretty cool is that minor and major are working on different parts of the chord, right? Minor lowers the third, major raises the 7th. You can combine those two together, right? So minor major chords exist. Take your default chords, lower the third by using minor, raise the 7th by using major, and now you've got this class of chords, minor major chords. Now the first 2 are fairly popular. I did a whole video on minor major 7th chord. That's awesome. If you add the 9th, it basically becomes the James Bond chord. But I'll admit that after that, I mean, I've never seen a G minor major 11 or a G minor major 13, but if you want to build them, now you know the formula. Start with your default chord, lower the third, raise the 7th. It has nothing to do with the minor scale or the major scale. Let's keep moving forward. This symbol shows up 2 different ways, just as a plus sign or as the letters AUG, and this means augmented. This symbol means that we're taking the 5th of the chord and we're raising it up a half step. So if we take our default chords, raise the 5th, we get G augmented 7th, G augmented 9th, etc. However, there's another way to write these exact same chords. What we just talked about are classical symbols. In more modern times, we have the jazz symbol, which is sharp 5. We put this at the end of the chord label instead. So we could do G7 sharp 5. That's the exact same thing as G augmented 7th. Or you could do G13 sharp 5. It's the same as G augmented 13th. So keep in mind, we've got different ways to talk about the exact same chords now. And that's, in my opinion, the most confusing thing about modern day chord labels is there's a lot of ways to talk about the same thing. So we're raising the 5th with the sharp 5 sign, but we can also raise the 7th at the same time with the major sign, and we get major sharp 5 chords, or the classical equivalent would be augmented major chords. So for example, here's my default chord, G7, right? If I want to raise the 5th, I have a G augmented 7th. If I want to raise the 7th, I have a G augmented major 7th, which we could also just write as G major 7 sharp 5. So, this class of chords could be written 3 possible different ways depending on what notation you're using. Let's learn 4 more, and we're going to learn them with this symbol. You can guess that this lowers the 5th of a chord. And this gets combined with all sorts of different chords. Most commonly, we'll just see it on our default chord. So we have G7 flat 5, G9 flat 5. These would all be considered kinds of altered chords because the 5th has been moved up or down, just like our last class of chords. But we can also combine flat 5 with minor. And we get chords like G minor 7 flat 5, G minor 9 flat 5. And so on and so on. Now that first one's really popular. This first chord actually has its own special name called half diminished. But it's the only half diminished chord out there. It's kind of unique. And it also gets its own special symbol, this weird little symbol. So this is worth pointing out that out of this entire class of chords, this one's kind of famous. It's diatonic in our major and minor scales. It's actually a very popular chord. And we can also combine the flat 5 sign with the major sign. So now we're lowering the 5th, but also raising the 7th. And we get chords like major 7 flat 5 and major 9 flat 5. 4 brand new kinds of altered chords. Once again, we're going to use that word altered if the 5th has been displaced up or down. Now, one of the trickiest symbols to get used to is this one. It's pronounced diminished and it has this special little sign. And this is telling us we're lowering the 3rd, and the 5th, and the 7th if it's present. Now, if we really do the math, the 7th has already been lowered, right? By default, our 7th is a flat 7. So if we lower that again, we get a double flatted 7, which ends up being the chord formula for this weird batch of chords. Take a G7, lower its 3rd and its 5th and its 7th, and we get this chord formula G diminished 7, which would also be written with this little sign. We can also do G diminished 9th and G diminished 11th, though I've never seen or heard that chord in the real world, but you can't do G diminished 13th, because a 13th, we already discussed, is the same thing as a 6th. Well, when you flat a flat 7th, it also becomes a 6th. So double flatted 7ths and 6ths end up being the exact same thing. Now we're going to learn 4 different symbols at the same time here, and this really opens the doors up to thousands of new chords. These are called alterations, and we're going to discuss the most popular alterations that you'll encounter. They look like this: flat 9, sharp 11, and flat 13. If you paid attention at the beginning of this video, you already know what a 9 is, so you should be able to guess what a flat 9 is. It's the same thing as a flat 2. And the same thing as a sharp 9. We call that a sharp 2. Yes, it's equivalent to a minor third, but we're not going to call it that. We're just going to call them 9ths and 11ths and 13ths from now on. What these symbols do, it says, hey, if you have a 9th, let's look at flat 9, for example. If you see a flat 9 symbol, it says, if your chord has a 9th in it, lower it. If your chord does not have a 9th in it, add in flat 9. So it's literally just inserting that tone in, or it's altering a present tone. So look at a chord like this, G7 flat 9. Well, G7 does not have a 9th in it, so we're adding in flat 9. How about this chord, G13 flat 9? Well, we know that G13 by default has a 9th in it. You should have memorized that in the very first section of this video, but this symbol means that 9th is going to get lowered. All right, and that's how all these different symbols work. And in conjunction with what we just learned, I'd like to introduce the add symbol. This symbol really just tells us that we're skipping an extension that should have been there. So, C9 is supposed to include the 7th, right? But if I want to ditch that 7th completely, I could just say C add 9. And that tells me we took a C triad and we've added the 9th. I could also do stuff like C add flat 9. I could add in an altered extension as well. So this add is literally just allowing us to tack on any note we want without including all the other lower stuff that's supposed to come along for the ride. Most popularly, this is used if you're skipping the 7th alone, but you can combine multiple extensions together. You could do something like C major 7, add sharp 11, flat 13. And now you've got all those alterations in part of that add sign. So it's just a convenient way to really specify the exact notes you want in a chord if you don't want the performer to improvise on that at all. However, the add sign is optional a lot of times. So a chord like G7 add sharp 11, that's sometimes how I'd write it because it really kind of indicates we've taken a G7, we've added a sharp 11. But a lot of composers will just write G7 sharp 11. And it just implies, hey, we're adding this in there. And finally, before we get to the leftovers, we've got suspended chords. What suspended means is that we are removing the third completely, and we're replacing it with either a 2 or a 4. So C is 1, 3, 5. C sus2, we'll get rid of that 3, replace it with 2. C sus4, get rid of the 3 and replace it with 4. We can also suspend bigger chords like major 7th chords. We can have major 7 sus2, major 7 sus4, or 7 sus2 or 7 sus4. But the suspended thing gets kind of weird when you get into 9ths and 11th chords. Because remember, the 9th and the 11th is already there. So chords can be written many different ways when you start including the suspended tag. And you just have to be careful and do your math on what you're actually telling the reader. What's helpful to know, though, is you can also use this symbol, no third. And it just literally tells us we're removing the third altogether. We're not even replacing it with anything else. Okay, so that's pretty much everything. There's only a few stragglers, a few leftover bits of chord data that doesn't fit into that schema that we just talked about. The first one is 6th chords. These are really easy, but like I said, they don't quite fit into that whole system. To make a 6th chord, and this is what we would call a jazz version of a 6th chord, we literally just add a major 6th to a triad. So here's a G chord, and we add a 6th, we get G6. Here's a G minor chord, we add a 6th, we get G minor 6th. Now that last chord, a lot of people spell it wrong. A lot of people build that one wrong because they think that little M6, they think it's talking about a minor 6th interval. Remember, when you see M, it's only lowering the third. Very helpful to remember. That's all that little M sign does. There is no minor 6th in the minor 6th chord. Pretty strange. In some cases, you might just want to add a flat 6 interval to a triad, in which case you could use this symbol, flat 6. Make sure you put it in parentheses, though, because it might get confused as part of the actual chord. So here we have G major, flat 6, and we have G minor, flat 6. Now with these jazz 6 chords, you might see them combined with other extensions using a slash sign. So you might see a chord like G6/9, and that literally means we're playing a G with a 6th and a 9th. This notation does not work if there's a 7th around. If there's any 7th in your chord, go back to what we just learned, all right? So if there's 7ths hanging around, then we should have called these all 13th chords. But if there's no 7th hanging around, this jazz notation of 6/9, 6/11, that's more popular. Listen, I didn't write these rules, I'm just repeating them to you, but 6th is reserved for when there's no 7th present. If there is a 7th present, call it a 13th. I also want to talk about what 6th chord means from a classical perspective. We've got chords like G6/4 and G6/3. Well, these are just inverted chords. And when you invert a triad, you end up creating some type of 6th between the notes in there. So I've done a video on inverted chords and the next type of chord we're going to talk about, slash chords. I've linked that below because it's described in much more detail. But when you hear the word 6th chord from a classical perspective, it doesn't mean the that we're adding a sixth to the chord. That's not what it means. You'll also hear words like augmented sixth chord. That's not an augmented chord, nor is it a sixth chord like we just learned. Or the Neapolitan sixth chord. That's something completely different. So I'll do videos on both of those chords, but keep in mind that classical sixth chords are nothing like what we just discussed. They refer to intervals of sixths that exist within that chord. Now, lastly, my favorite symbol in music theory is this one. If we're not dealing with that whole jazz sixth chord thing, this symbol just means, hey, we're bringing in a new bass note. And that allows us to just create all sorts of crazy new chords. You don't have to think about inversions, and you can name things very, very simply just by saying, hey, I've taken this chord and I've added in this new bass note. So with the slash sign, that's all we're doing. We're inserting a bass note at the end, and that allows us a lot of freedom for chord names. The very last chord we're going to talk about is this one, 7 alt. This is a totally unique chord, and it's basically referring to any type of altered dominant. Now, an altered dominant chord is a dominant chord. Well, that was our first class of chords, the very first thing we learned, but we've altered it somehow. We've either included in a sharp 5 or a flat 5, or we've included in a sharp 9 or a flat 9. And however those got there, maybe we moved the ninth up or we moved the ninth down, or we've just tacked in that note. Doesn't matter. If we've got an altered tone as part of a dominant chord, we call that an altered dominant. In the jazz world, 7 alt covers hundreds of different chords. So this is not a specific chord label. I can't give you the formula for this. I can just say any altered dominant. So if you're working with a band and this chord shows up, you should probably coordinate with them to figure out what kind of altered dominant you're actually going to play. That's it. You did it. You learned all of the chords. I think there's a few things that are worth mentioning that are still outside of the scope of this video, but polychords, that's when you play 2 chords at the exact same time, and you literally just write them on top of each other. So like C over C sharp. We're literally playing a C triad and a C sharp triad at the exact same time. Not a very pleasant sound, but there's, plenty of music where it works very effectively. I also need to mention there's plenty of chords that we just can't name. Lots of cluster chords where there's chromatic notes right next to each other. I mean, our chord naming system, as we learned it, just can't handle that stuff. And that's where you go back to reading sheet music. It's going to give you all the information that you actually need regarding a chord. And lastly, you might find alterations outside of the one in this video. I know that in deep realms of jazz, you'll find things like flat 4s, which still really, or sharp 13s. And you're getting into some enharmonic trickery that's beyond my ability to parse. So just be warned, if you're deep into the weeds of jazz, this is not an exhaustive history of chords. But it should leave you very well equipped to interpret and parse and read every single chord label that comes your way. Now, before I end things here, just keep in mind, we didn't talk at all about how to use these chords, which is kind of depressing to me. But honestly, that's what the other, 30 chapters in my book are all about, on how to write chord progressions and how they work together. So if you enjoyed this lesson, I am telling you, you're really going to love the Chord Progression Codex. I know that shipping and the cost of the book's going to be a little high for some of you, so I will be offering a digital version of that as well for much cheaper. And of course, if you know how I do business, if you're ever having problems with some of the finances of forwarding my stuff, you can just contact me directly, and I'm happy to make an exception for you. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something, and a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for making this video possible, for making my book possible. They've been incredibly patient and generous over the last 2 years as I abandoned YouTube to go on this quest for the Chord Codex. So all of the praise unto them. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.